This clip is a brief introduction to ACTML, or the Attentional Control Theory of Multimedia Learning. According to this theory, learning from multimedia begins when an adult or child watches a graphic or animation, listens to speech, music, or a sound effect, reads some text, focuses his or her attention to learn, which automatically sends and receives data to and from their long-term memory. Unlike entertainment multimedia, educational multimedia requires reading and listening to instructions and feedback presented in the program or website. Learning is dependent upon reading and listening, and yet reading is not the same as listening psychologically. Whereas good readers can use their context-free word recognition skills, poor and beginning readers use repetitive sentence context. Poor readers gain more from context than good readers. Young and beginning readers especially rely on context to read, showing a heavy reliance on contextual facilitation of word perception because they are less adept at contextual facilitation of comprehension than children in higher grades. When we see a visual event presented in multimedia, we start to form our own interface of spatial and visual data in a separate visual spatial memory by resketching the graphic or animation through our own visual system, like an inner eye. Types of visual events include a sketch or diagram, a static or animated photograph, pictograph, film image or video clip image, animated GIF, cartoon, computerized tutor, coach, or mentor with human likeness or even a cartoon, appearing as an avatar or agent, static or moving. Similarly, when we hear audio in multimedia, a direction, feedback, a hint, or warning, we start to encode the gist as our own acoustic image into a phonological store. Some of our acoustic images evolve responses and evoke responses within visual areas of our brain. We extract different information from each working attention channel by our attentional control system. As learners, we strive to create our own version of the media, called a coherent episode, from which we build a new schema for ourselves. That said, multimedia learning requires more from us than synaptic responses to sensory stimulation, hence the need for instructional design. This clip has been a brief introduction to attentional control theory of multimedia learning as a rationale for using an instructional design model to develop educational multimedia. I want now to take a look at some slides and go through some slides with you. If we look at the first slide on multimedia learning in general, we're going to first of all look at familiar and unfamiliar tasks and compare the kind of working attention for familiar and unfamiliar tasks, or difficult and easy tasks. They will be different. Then we'll look at the attentional control theory of multimedia learning in a graphical way and a little bit more in-depth discussion about that. And another model that is based on the balanced input theory that we described before, called the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. We'll also take a look at a well-respected model of illustrations by Carney and Levin. So let's have a look at the comparison of working attention during difficult or let's say easy first, easy and familiar versus difficult and unfamiliar tasks. So we see here two models. The one on the left, the contemporary model of human working memory, we see normal effort associated with normal cognitive load from a balanced input across both channels. In other words, there's some input from visually, and there's some audio input as well. So processing is straightforward. Now, we also should see what the output will be. If you're in your instructional design, you're requiring the students or participants to, let's say, draw something, that's different than if you're asking them to, let's say, get up and speak. All right? So if you're giving them a graphic and asking them to speak about it, they will require referential connections between the two auditory and visual channels. And so if there's sufficient information in both channels in the input side, it's reasonable that you can expect a good result from students on the output. Now let's look at the right-hand side. If the text is overloaded, now cognitive load theory, as we talked about in other clips, this is their major contention, is that computer text, graphics, or animation all, and as I think we're still in the silent era with respect to computing, that we're expected to split our attention between all these things. So especially if there's reading involved, then it's critical, if there's critical information. If it's in a work situation where the employee is, like with some of these warning systems, required to prioritize the importance of the warning system, if they're all visual, they're going to have a very difficult job. Similarly, if they're all auditory, they will have a difficult job, as with the 3 Mile Island incident, where 100 audio systems went off at the same time and they could not prioritize the importance of the systems. So we see on the right-hand side then a very high cognitive load with a lot of very high mental effort required in order to differentiate the different information coming in from computer text graphics, and no auditory input, which is usually the case. In which case it's very difficult to make auditory output, especially with young children where you have no, the auditory loop, their articulatory loop has not been developed yet. Okay, so it is quite a concern for those of us designing instruction when we are aware that working attention can be hampered both by the development of the child and even adolescent, and also by the ability to read within a language, okay, with a particular language. And of course the input, how much input is it, if it's mostly visual or if it's mostly auditory. No, it's not going to work. We have to make they have to complement one another, and it doesn't, not just seeding, signaling and weeding out, as Mayer says. It has to be a complement so that the student can process the gist of the information and it's remembered a lot later. You'll remember what I said perhaps now, the gist of it, sometime later. But if you were reading if you read this article, perhaps, or some of these articles that you may remember certain details that you found within the text, even have a mental picture of what page they were on, how far down the page, and so on. Let's look at this again then, the attentional control theory, multimedia learning. The ultimate aim of multimedia instruction and feedback is enhanced long-term memory, and I'm agreed with John Sweller on this, that the cognitive load theorist, that is our primary purpose. So why then are most studies, when research is done, they look at the treatment and they create an immediate test right after the treatment? It does not measure the lasting effects of the treatment. So in research that I've done and some others, we're starting to see this more often now. There is a delay so that the research can determine the long-term effects of audio and visuals as they're put together. Okay? Enhanced long-term memory then requires that the students can control their attention to the text, graphics, and animations and sound. Controlling their own attention requires that the student forms their own interface between the spatial and visual data. This is something that I've mentioned before in previous clip or in other clips. And they create this, what Baddeley calls a visual spatial sketchpad. And the phenomenon, I won't use the word phenomenon because it's not phenomenology, but it is a concept that's like an inner eye, like you're looking in on yourself, like you're almost like a daydream, if you like, okay? And you have an image that you've conjured up, you've reconstructed from the stimuli yourself. We encode the gist of the sound as an acoustic image. So because we understand language, we can fashion this acoustic image as we want. Of course, it may be biased, and hence, in fact, it can be manipulated quite easily. Hence, we have a lot of research in the law on false witness testimony in children, where acoustic images that they've reconstructed get modified by adults who want them to speak in certain ways and so on. And there's quite a large literature on false witness testimony and reconstructing the gist and manipulating gist for witnesses. The student subvocalizes text using an articulatory system. When we're talking about students now, we're talking about adults primarily and older adolescents and so on. So they create this they create this sense of the meaning in the text as if they're talking to themselves, listening to themselves, trying to explain it. Now we're talking about difficult information, unfamiliar information, new information, and instructional designers should be aware of this. So these inner voice and inner ear, we're talking to ourselves and listening to ourselves and reconstructing what we believe to be the meaning from what we hear. And we, as learners, start to try to control our attention to both the acoustic image and the visual spatial images. And what the outcome is, which is quite resilient to forgetting, is that the auditory stimuli has we call it the gist. That gist stays with us quite a long time. And as we get older, kind of nice for those of us who are older, we have a greater expansion of that capability, almost as if we learn to reconstruct details from the gist. So even though visuals you tend to pick out details from visuals, and we tend to understand meanings from listening, older people can actually pick out details through their acoustic image, try to make references with very little information from the gist. So now, this diagram here shows the attentional control theory of multimedia learning. And we've been talking along the left side there, you can see inner eye, inner voice, inner ear, acoustic image, coherent episode. From the readings that you've done, I wonder if you take a minute right now to try to fill in where you think the auditory channel is, where the visual channel might be, what that thing in the middle is, the box in the middle, what does that represent? Okay, the gray area down below, what does that area represent? What do those two boxes on the side represent? Just take a minute to put that together for yourself, reconstruct it in your own visual spatial sketch pad, as it were. Okay, think about that for a second. And once you're ready with that, I'll just send along more or less the answer to it. How we learn from audio visuals is that the learner listens to speech, music, or sound effects that motivates, directs, instructs, hints, reminds, and gives feedback. That's the arrow on the left, represents the arrow on the left. Way over on the right, the learner can read text if they're familiar in the language, watch as a graphic or an animation as a visual event. And these point towards, as badly as called in working attention, a executive controller. The executive controller is that strategy that we have as learners. Because we're goal-directed towards learning, we're not talking here about on vacation, we're simply browsing something, or we're listening to somebody talk on documentary. No, the learner must have the goal in themselves to want to learn something, okay? Given that, they try to put together what they have, what they're listening to, what they're watching, process this data to focus attention so that they will learn. Now they want to create these episodes from the data, and in this area we call a episodic buffer, or what Baddeley calls an episodic buffer. There's also simultaneously creating these episodes a constant feedback between the auditory channel and the visual channel. Now this is a dual channel model, and fair enough, their Polition from the early 80s did have a single mode of memory, but you know, Pavio had dual channel. It was different. Baddeley has another, and Neath and myself are very much involved with the dual channel because we think that things can happen and we can learn to manipulate the channels for ourselves. For instance, talking on the phone and writing a message tells me that we can manage to do 2 or 3 things at once. You probably, some of you have children who can listen to the television, text, do their homework all at the same time, and it's mind-boggling how they can do it all at once. Well, it's because they have this facility to be able to manipulate the stimuli, and still with the goal of learning. So we have the auditory memory, which is a phonological store, essentially, and for young people, though, that phonological store is not very resilient to changes. There's no development of a phonological loop, phonological, or later called articulatory loop, that allows for this thinking aloud, as it were. At the same time, children and adults have a visual spatial sketchpad to re-sketch what they are seeing. And this is this constant movement into the executive controller and this kind of negotiation between auditory and visual stimuli in order to create these episodes and compare them with long-term memory. Now, these things are not mutually exclusive. These theories are not all this or that one or the other one. I think that we can borrow quite a bit from one another. Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning is an interesting theory. Again, it's not tested in long-term situations to say, well, my grade 7s will learn much better with educational media than if I get someone in, a teacher in, to tell them. Well, I wouldn't go that far. The same with companies. To bring in experts may be a better option than using multimedia. But we can still benefit from multimedia if we pay attention to these models, these theories. Now, Mayer's model or theory is a descriptive model. It's a psychological model. Same as the attentional control theory. Again, we've got psychological, which tends to describe, this is what happened, I watched these students, this is what happened in the classroom, or I was watching them in the lab, they were doing this, or it took them this long to do something. So it's all about description and what happened. Instructional design is prescription. It's like a recipe. It's like a cookbook. So if you have instruction, like the ADDIE model, the ADDIE model is a prescription, it's a cookbook, it's a recipe, but there is no foundation for the ADDIE model. It's simply an heuristic for describing design in a few words, okay? It does not rely on any theory, which is not the case with the attention control, with the SSF model of instructional design, which does rely on theory. Gagne's model relies on his conditions of learning. That's an instructional design model that relies on his conditions, particularly external conditions of learning. But Richard Mayer's model is not an instructional design model. It's a descriptive model. And yet we can still take some benefit from the model. So we're going to just take a few minutes here to go through the principles once again. And because it's useful to us to understand. And by the way, some of these things cross over. Split attention, yes, it works with attentional control. It also, split attention, you'll see in the literature on cognitive load theory as well. So split attention principles, adults learn better when the instructional material does not require them to split their attention between multiple sources of mutually referring information. Another principle that he has for his theory is a modality principle, that concurrent sequential presentations require that adults learn better, or suggest that adults will learn better when the information is presented as speech than as text. Another principle that he has called redundancy principle, that adults learn better from animation and narration than from animation, narration, and text if the visual is presented simultaneously. Now, this is another faculty member here at Memorial, Catherine Penny, who has done a lot of substantial work on this particular process of concurrent versus simultaneous presentations in auditory and visual modes. Particularly in 1989. Okay, spatial contiguity principle, that adults, I have put this word adults in because most of his experiments deal, as I said, with undergraduate psychology students, so we can't leap to, and I don't want to see instructional designs that base, if you're dealing with kids at K to 12, that you're not going to, you're going to be conditional in your, let's say it that way, you're going to be conditional in your, when you cite. If you cite this theory that, yes, it's for undergraduates, but it may apply for grade 7s, let's say. You know, you think it may, but yet it's a testable hypothesis, something you might do in a thesis, in fact. There is also something else about redundancy. Of course, redundancy along a wire is a good way to maximize the probability that a message will be received, also same in communication theory. But in education, it can create cognitive load, extraneous cognitive load, as we've already talked about, and you don't want that. So, in fact, if you don't create enough information, sometimes students will get bored. So underload can become overload, if you like. They become bored, they become restless, they'll look for other things to do. So redundancy, generally speaking, is not a good idea, particularly to put several visual pieces of information that say the same thing in a presentation. Spatial contiguity principle, adults learn better when text and visuals are physically integrated rather than separated. Temporal contiguity, adults learn better when visuals and text or speech are synchronized rather than separated in time. Coherence principle, adults learn better when extraneous material is excluded rather than included in the multimedia presentation. So when we're thinking about instructional design, and thinking about these principles, another way of saying it is for split attention, given a choice between presenting an animation with text or with speech, you would choose to present it with speech. Okay, but you don't. I want to put a codicil on here. Is you don't want to go on and on. It's not a narration. It's not a. You're not voiceover for a film. Okay, and people these days, the attention span, even when they're working on their attention, is very quick. very quick. If we don't catch them and we can't keep them very long. So keep your details in text. Make your narrations cue rather than narrate. Okay? Modality principle, give a choice between presenting an animation with text or with speech, simultaneous or sequentially. You choose to present either in speech. Okay? The redundancy principle, given the choice to make a sequential presentation of graphics, then sound or text, or a simultaneous presentation of graphics, sound, and text, you would choose to make a sequential presentation. Linear is generally better. It's more direct. Now, those of you who are constructivist in your particular preference, I understand that but nevertheless, you can still, when we're talking about at the micro level, at the presentation level, you can still make presentations this way and still maintain the instructional method as a constructivist instructional method. Okay? Given the choice to make a sequential presentation of graphics, then sound or text, redundant or not, you should choose to make it redundant. Now, in this case, we're talking about make it redundant over the entire program. Okay? This is similar to the news anchor. When a news anchor says at the beginning, this is what the highlight of the news are, or these are the headlines. Okay? Then they'll tell you the story, then they'll do something called a recap. So it's pre-cap, then the story, then recap. These things are still in place today, even for videos or for short queuing over an entire program or website clip. Okay? Spatial contiguity. Given a choice between putting text physically close to an animation or separating the text from the animation or running the narration with the animation, you would run the narration with the animation. If it's essential, particularly if it's a story. But my preference is, again, different from Mayer's. My preference is to use sound like a cue to tell them. Let a picture tell a story. Get the student or participant to imagine. Use their imagination. Get them to reconstruct things on their own a little bit more. Temporal contiguity, given a choice between adding an entire explanatory narration or adding concurrent animation plus narration, or adding small chunks of narration, you would choose to use either concurrent animation plus narration or small chunks of narration. Now again, this is the closest that Rich Mayer and I get to in terms of theoretical understanding. His small chunks, he calls them signals. You know, I go back as far as Skinner and his reinforcement theory and operational conditioning, operant conditioning, with the idea that cueing can allow the student, once reflection and some time has passed, to construct it on their own. Okay. But we are close on this small chunks of narration and cueing. It seems to me it's just the nature of cueing is different than small chunks. Given the decision of whether or not to add music or sound effects to punctuate or reinforce instruction or feedback, you would not add music or sound effects because we would call that cosmetic. So he and I are in agreement on that, I think. So you can have a look at this for yourselves. Pause this. I won't go through it, but you can see the overlap of where my theory and Mayer's theory do have some interesting overlaps, and it's worth, I think, considering when you're thinking about designing the audio for visual events. We've been talking about the importance of sound for cueing visual events and multimedia and for learning purposes. I want to spend 1 minute on the visual side, but how text and graphics can interrelate. Carney and Levin is a popular psychological model. It's an instructional model, actually. Although it's psychological, it does tend to be prescriptive. And it's consistent with a major psychological model developed by Alan Pavio at the University of Western Ontario called dual coding theory. So we'll just run through these tenets, 10 tenets for teachers quickly about illustrations. So select pictures that overlap with textual content. Make easy to follow text that is concrete and engaging. Ensure prerequisite basic reading skills. Choose pictures with the functions they are intended to play. I want to stop there for a second. There's something called a Stroop effect. In 1935, there was a study that was carried out by a man named Stroop, of course, and he determined that if you show a particular picture, let's say of a train, and then show, so we're looking at a picture of a train and we're talking about something completely different, like what I did on my summer vacation that has nothing to do with the train, there is confusion, if you like. And that has come to be called a Stroop effect, okay, a Stroop effect. So that's what this is all about, is that choose the pictures with the functions they are intended to play. So just, don't you talk about balloons if you're really talking about trains. The more complex the text, the more likely the pics will help. Direct students to do something with the picture that yields a controllable product. In software use, integrated or pop-up displays, then split displays. Okay, so what that means, of course, is that sometimes you'll see in computers similar to what you used to see in the old-fashioned television programs of the 60s, or black and white television programs where they would split the screen sometimes, and you'd get action happening on both sides of the screen. What's better is a pop-up away from the screen. In fact, I recommend that to you when you're designing your instruction. Rather than go to another page, if there's something quickly that can pop up as a kind of definition, do that, okay? Away from a graphic, let's say, or a difficult paragraph. And you, for some reason, you're already using enough sound. Account for different styles, images versus verbal. Okay, again, using dual coding the language. Image on one side of the brain, this is my image channel. This is my verbal. Verbal meaning both spoken, by the way, and written. But it's using the language that I know, okay? Using the language I know, and using that spatial ability that I have. So accounting for different learning styles, yes, but we know from 1979 with Swassing and Barb that it's just, we can't say that they're predispositions. Well, I'm an auditory learner, so I like to talk all day. That's how I learn. I'm a visual learner. I like to watch the teacher say something. I'm a kinesthetic learner. I like to get up and actually do it. Well, I like to do that. Maybe I'm a auditory learner now because I happen to be talking a lot. But later today, I might be a visual learner because I have to find out where to go and I have to look on a map. Okay, so there's no evidence to show that, and certainly there's no impact on the dependent variable. There's no reason to think that your educational media is going to be more successful by slicing up people into styles and categorizing them by modalities, okay? But you can, as Howard Gardner said at McGill once, that you can take into account multiple, not so much intelligences, but preferences towards modalities, okay? Realize shortcomings in most pictures and illustrations. Learn to design, use transformational or mnemonics as to pictorial adjunctive aids to the text. Okay, and that's it for the 10. Worth keeping in mind, along with all the other tools in your tool belt now, you should have beginning to see how multimedia design can be, an instructional design of multimedia with these aids for you should make for quite a robust educational experience for your students.